6 hours of gunfire, 4 bodies at the end. One of them was 14 years old, July 22nd, 2003. 1 in the afternoon, Mosul, Iraq. Uday Hussein, 39, is cornered inside a mansion in the Al-Falah neighborhood. Next to him is his brother Qusay, 37. And with them is Mustafa, Qusay's teenage son, 14 years old, terrified, holding a rifle. There's a fourth man too, a bodyguard whose name doesn't matter, because for history only 3 surnames matter. Hussein inside, Hussein outside. More than 200 American soldiers from the 10th Airborne Division surround the building. Apache helicopters hover low overhead. The orders are clear. Capture them alive if possible, dead if necessary. Inside, the Hussein brothers know exactly how this ends. They shoot for 6 hours. 6 hours of constant crossfire. 10 Tau anti-tank missiles punch through the walls. The building collapses floor by floor. The roof caves in. Fire consumes everything. And when silence finally arrives, 4 bodies lie among the rubble-burned, unrecognizable at first. Uday Hussein, Qusay Hussein, Mustafa Hussein, and an unnamed bodyguard. 3 members of the most powerful family in Iraq, dead on the same day in the same house, defending a position they had already lost before they even started. Why? Why did the son of the man who ruled Iraq for 24 years end up dying like a cornered fugitive? Why did Qusay, who could have negotiated, who could have surrendered to save his son, choose to die beside his brother? And why did a 14-year-old pay with his life for decisions his grandfather made decades before he was even born? Because Uday Hussein had everything. Unlimited power, incalculable wealth, palaces, luxury cars, access to anything he wanted. He was the Prince of Baghdad, the heir to an empire, and yet he died cornered in a borrowed house, hiding under a false name, with the most powerful army in the world hunting him. Because the answer isn't in the headlines. It's in what Saddam Hussein did to his children for decades, in how he raised them not as people, but as instruments of power. In the price they paid for a surname they never chose. And when you learn what Saddam did to Uday in 1988 in front of the entire family after Uday made an unforgivable mistake, you'll understand why this story is far darker than the world ever imagined. Because Uday wasn't the only one of Saddam Hussein's children trapped between extreme privilege and absolute terror. There was Qusay Hussein, the obedient son, the one who never failed, the one who became head of the Republican Guard and controlled the intelligence services, the one Saddam eventually chose as his true heir, pushing Uday aside. He died on July 22nd, 2003, protecting his own son in the last minutes of that battle. There was also Raghad Hussein, the oldest daughter, the only one who escaped before everything collapsed. She fled to Jordan with her husband, Hussein Kamal, who betrayed Saddam by revealing Iraq's chemical weapons programs. When her husband returned to Baghdad, believing in an amnesty he'd been promised, he was executed. She never went back. Today, she lives in Amman, defending her father's legacy to anyone who will listen. 3 children, 3 lives marked by the same surname. 3 radical decisions in response to the same impossible question. How do you survive when your father is one of the most feared men in the world? This is their story. The story that for decades stayed hidden behind the Ba'athist regime's official communique, Saddam's televised speeches, and the carefully constructed images of a united family ruling Iraq. Because when your father is Saddam Hussein, you are not a person. You are an extension of the regime and instrument, a political symbol, a piece on the board of absolute power. And pieces don't have the right to question, to fail, to be human. But Uday questioned it. Qusay obeyed to the end. Raghad ran the moment she understood that family loyalty wasn't enough to survive. Why? Because what they lived inside the presidential palaces of Baghdad, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, yet watched every second look nothing like what the world saw from the outside. And what you're about to hear is the truth that stayed buried under the ruins of the regime for 2 decades. To understand why they died in that house in Mosul on July 22nd, 2003, you have to go back 66 years to 1937. Saddam Hussein is born in Al-Auja, a poor village near Tikrit. His father disappears before he is born. His stepfather beats him systematically throughout his childhood. He grows up sleeping with the sheep in winter, without formal education, surviving in a tribal region where loyalty to the clan is everything. In 1968, at 31, Saddam takes part in the coup that brings the Ba'ath Party to power under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Al-Bakr becomes president, but Saddam is vice president and the one who truly controls the intelligence services, the purges, the real power. In July 1979, Saddam finally becomes president. His first act is to convene a meeting of the party's central leadership. He announces he has uncovered a conspiracy and reads names from a list. One by one, the accused are escorted out and executed in the following days. The message is unmistakable. No one is safe if they question his authority. For 24 years, he rules Iraq with absolute control. For some Iraqis, especially at first, he represents stability. He builds hospitals, expands education, nationalizes oil. But that development comes with a brutal security apparatus. Arbitrary arrests, systematic torture, entire families disappearing because one member dissented. In 1980, he invades Iran. The war lasts 8 years, more than 1 million dead. Chemical weapons used for the first time since World War I. It ends in 1988 with no winter-only destruction. In 1990, he invades Kuwait. A U.S.-led international coalition expels Iraqi forces in weeks. The United Nations imposes economic sanctions that collapse Iraq's economy throughout the next decade. Hundreds of thousands of children die from causes linked to the sanctions, while Saddam builds opulent palaces. And behind that public image was a private family life. Saddam married Sajida Talfa in 1963. They had 5 children: Uday in 1964, Qusay in 1966, Raghad in 1967, Rana in 1969, and Hala in 1972. For decades, the family remained hidden behind walls of security. Dozens of palaces across Iraq, each one a fortress with underground bunkers, guards at every entrance, sophisticated security systems. Saddam constantly rotated between residences, obsessed with avoiding assassination. And inside those palaces, Saddam raised his children not as people, but as instruments of power, where a father wasn't simply a father, but the president who decided who lived and who died in an entire country. His children were extensions of that power, tools, symbols, pieces on a board where the only player was him. Now you need to understand something fundamental about growing up as the child of a man with absolute power. Imagine you're 8 years old. You live in a palace so large you can walk for 10 minutes and still be inside it. There are pools, endless gardens. Any toy you mention appears the next day. But when you step into the garden, there are armed men every 20 meters. Automatic rifles, earpieces. They don't look at you directly, but they're watching you at all times. You can't go out into the street. There are no walks through Baghdad. Every outing is planned days in advance. Armored vehicles, bodyguards spread across multiple cars. And when you arrive anywhere, the entire place has been evacuated. No other kids, just secured empty spaces. And when you finally meet other children at official events, they don't treat you like an equal. Their parents told them, be polite, don't contradict him, let him win. You can see the falseness in their eyes. They aren't friends. They're actors. You turn 16 and fall in love, but every person you interact with is investigated by intelligence. Their families analyzed. If there's any doubt about loyalty, the relationship ends, not with a conversation, but with men who visit their home, with warnings everyone understands. You turn 20. You want to choose your career: medicine, literature, a private life. But that's not an option. Your father needs the family visible inside the structures of power, so your path was already decided: military, intelligence services, state organization. Your future isn't yours. And through all of that, a question grows like a cancer. Is anyone in my life real? Does anyone love me without the surname? Every friend might be genuine, or an informant, or someone who can't afford to reject the president's son. Every woman who agrees to go out with you does it because she wants you, or wants power, or is terrified to say no. Everyone who laughs at your jokes, are they real? Or are they afraid that contradicting the leader's child is dangerous? You have marble palaces, luxury cars, travel, every material privilege. But you don't have authenticity. You don't have the freedom to know your relationships are real. You can't fail without it becoming a matter of state. You can't be vulnerable without it being recorded. Uday lived with that impossibility for 39 years. Qusay for 37, Raghad for 58 so far. And what that impossibility did to them is what you're about to discover. And this is where the story gets darker. Because growing up under surveillance is horrifying, but at least it doesn't damage your body. It's psychological, invisible. But Saddam didn't control them only through surveillance. He controlled them through physical fear, direct violence, and everyone knew it because they had witnessed what he was capable of. October 1988, Saddam organizes a private celebration. The war with Iran has finally ended. It's a party on the banks of the Tigris. Music, elaborate food, alcohol. Uday is there 24 years old. He already has a reputation. Impulsive, violent, unpredictable. That night he has drunk more than usual. Also there is Kamal Hana Gegio, Saddam's personal assistant, his food taster. The man who tries every dish before Saddam touches it. He has worked for Saddam for years. Saddam trusts him completely. During the party, Uday approaches him. An argument starts about Sajida, Uday's mother, and rumors that Saddam is with another woman. Gegeo says something Uday takes as an insult. The argument escalates. And then Uday pulls out a knife in front of generals, in front of officials, in front of his father, and stabs Kamal Hana Gegeo. Again and again. The man falls, blood staining the marble. He tries to crawl away, but Uday doesn't stop. He keeps going until the body stops moving. Kamal Hana Gegeo dies, Saddam's closest aide murdered by Saddam's eldest son, in the middle of an official celebration. Saddam witnessed everything. The room went completely silent. Everyone waited to see how the president would react. Saddam did not execute Uday. He couldn't admit that his heir was an uncontrollable killer that would weaken the regime. But in private, his fury was brutal. Uday was arrested, locked in a palace under guard for weeks with no contact with anyone. Saddam considered executing him. Officials later confirmed there were discussions about whether Uday had crossed an irreparable line. In the end, Saddam chose exile. Uday was sent to Switzerland, nominally as a diplomat in Geneva. It was a public humiliation for the heir. The exile lasted a year and a half, and during that time something critical happened back in Baghdad. Qusay began to occupy the empty space. Not openly, just by being present, being reliable, following orders. And Saddam began to see in Qusay something Uday never was: predictable, controllable, a perfect instrument. When Uday returned in 1990, he discovered that his position as heir was no longer unquestioned. Qusay was in meetings Uday was excluded from. Saddam trusted Qusay in ways he would never again trust Uday. And that loss of trust poisoned something inside Uday. It turned him into something even darker. Uday Hussein was born on June 18, 1964 in Baghdad, the first male child. From his earliest memory, he knew he was special, that his father was feared, that when he entered a room, people stood up. When he was 8, he wanted a toy another boy had. The boy refused. Uday hit him. The boy's father, a military officer, saw his son with a bleeding nose and approached Uday to tell him hitting was wrong. Uday answered, "My father is Saddam Hussein. I can do whatever I want." He was 8 years old when he said that. That one moment shows the environment he grew up in, a world with no limits, no boundaries shaping character, where every whim was satisfied, where the word no was something other people heard, but he never experienced. Unlike Qusay, who was quiet and observant, Uday was explosive from childhood. He craved attention. If his father was working, Uday wanted to see him. He would burst into official meetings. The guards didn't even try to stop him. During adolescence and early adulthood, he developed patterns everyone knew, but no one dared mention. He threw parties where alcohol flowed without limits. He summoned whoever he wanted, whether they wanted to attend or not. Receiving an invitation from Uday wasn't an honor. It was an order. There were young women at those parties. Some came willingly. Others were brought through pressure, and what happened there stayed secret for years because the victims understood that speaking meant risking their lives and their families' lives. He drove sports cars recklessly through Baghdad. There were crashes, people injured, and there were never consequences. In 1984, he founded the newspaper bubble. It wasn't journalism. It was personal propaganda attacking anyone who annoyed him, even important officials, and nobody could do anything, because criticizing Babel meant criticizing Uday. That same year, he was named president of Iraq's National Olympic Committee. Under his control, athletes who failed were tortured. National team footballers were beaten with iron bars after losing matches. Their heads were shaved publicly. They were forced to kick concrete balls until they bled. Sharar Haidar, a footballer who fled in the 1990s, later described it like this: "They played every match afraid not of the opposing team, but of losing, because they knew what awaited them." After the murder in 1988 and his exile, Uday returned in 1990 and realized Qusay had gained their father's trust. That loss of status made him even more dangerous. Through the 1990s, while Iraq suffered under sanctions and ordinary people stood in lines for ration bread, Uday built a parallel empire. He smuggled luxury cars in violation of sanctions: Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, dozens stored in private garages. He built opulent residences. One had a private zoo with lions. Another held a collection of weapons confiscated from museums. He lived in grotesque luxury as Iraq fell apart. The abuses escalated. Testimonies emerged of women kidnapped from Baghdad's streets, taken to his homes, raped, and released with warnings that if they spoke, their families would suffer. Latif Yahya, forced to serve as Uday's body double because of their physical resemblance, later wrote after escaping that Uday didn't see people as human beings. He saw them as objects, things for entertainment or for destruction. In 1996, Uday survived an assassination attempt. He was ambushed in Mansour, Baghdad, and hit by 17 bullets. He lived, but with permanent damage. He limped visibly. He needed a cane. The pain was constant. To manage it, he used painkillers mixed with alcohol, making him even more unpredictable. The attackers were never identified. There was speculation that the attack had been ordered by families Uday had harmed, or by officials who had finally had enough, or rumors never confirmed that Qusay was involved, seeing an opportunity to eliminate his brother. After the attack, Uday became more paranoid. He increased security, reduced public appearances, but he kept going with the same excesses. December 2002, 3 months before the American invasion, Saddam calls a family meeting to discuss contingencies. Everyone is there. Saddam talks for hours about resistance, but what stands out is how he ignores Uday for the entire meeting. When military plans come up, he speaks to Qusay. But Uday, sitting there, is treated like he's invisible, no important role, no opinion asked for, fully aware of his own irrelevance, and for the first time, Uday doesn't cause a scene. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't demand attention. He stays silent, watching Qusay receive the trust he himself has lost. March 2003. The United States invades. The regime collapses in weeks. On April 9th, Saddam's statues fall. The family runs. Uday and Qusay go into hiding. For months they move through Iraq, and they end up together in Mosul, in a house belonging to Nawaf al-Saidan, a regime sympathizer. They stay too long. Someone informs trading the information for the $15 million reward offered for each brother. July 22, 2003, 1 in the afternoon. Troops surround the mansion in Al-Falah. Loudspeakers order them to surrender. No response. Then shots from the windows. Uday, his leg damaged, living with constant pain, fires at American soldiers. He doesn't try to surrender. He doesn't negotiate. He just fights. The battle lasts 6 hours. 10 Tau missiles. Walls collapsing. The roof coming down. Fire. When it ends, there are 4 bodies. Uday is so mutilated he's almost unrecognizable. He is identified through dental records and the scars from 1996. Photos are published to confirm the deaths, and they spark controversy for showing the corpses in conditions many consider a violation of dignity. Uday had everything: the most powerful name in Iraq, unlimited wealth, power over millions, and he dies cornered in someone else's house, hiding under a false identity, married, defending a position that could not be defended. Why didn't he surrender? Maybe because he knew what capture would mean: being displayed, put on trial, forced to face victims, forced to watch the world confirm that he was a failure. Or maybe he simply didn't know how to surrender. He had lived his entire life taking without permission. He had never experienced real consequences. And in that final moment, the only thing he knew was how to fight. Uday chose excess without limits. He believed that if he couldn't earn respect through obedience, he'd earn it through brute force by being so visible, so feared that no one could ignore him. And he ended up dead at 39, with no heirs who remembered him with love, no achievements that could justify the abuses, only a list of victims who finally could speak. Today, more than 20 years later, there is no one left to defend him. His name is synonymous with the regime's worst excesses. His death is remembered with a dark sense of relief because at last he was stopped. But if Uday chose uncontrolled excess, Qusay chose the opposite path, and what that reveals about survival strategies is completely different. Qusay Hussein was born on May 17, 1966, 2 years after Uday. From the moment he was old enough to understand, he grasped the truth. His only chance to survive was not to make his brother's mistakes. While Uday was loud and impulsive, Qusay was quiet, watchful. At family gatherings, while Uday interrupted to demand attention, Qusay sat in corners listening, learning, absorbing how power was discussed. His mother noticed that Qusay could wait. When they played games as children, Uday had to win immediately. If he lost, he would destroy the game. Qusay could lose again and again without visible frustration, waiting for the right moment. When he was 11, he wrote an essay about leadership, where he argued that successful leaders weren't necessarily the most charismatic, but the most careful, the ones who knew when to act and when to wait. He was 11 when he wrote that. When he turned 16, he took a different road from Uday, the army, not as a pampered son chasing titles. He entered the military academy and completed full training. He was assigned to the Republican Guard and showed real competence. During the Iran-Iraq War, he served in genuine combat positions at the front. Soldiers who served with him described a young officer who never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do first. Saddam noticed. He noticed that while Uday created scandals in Baghdad, Qusay was in the trenches, following orders without seeking glory. The relationship between Qusay and Saddam was different. Saddam saw in Uday an exaggerated reflection of his own worst impulses, unstable, dangerous. But in Qusay, he saw the perfect instrument of his will. There was no dramatic affection. Saddam was not a loving father, but with Qusay, he developed absolute operational trust. After the Gulf War, Shiite groups began an uprising in southern Iraq. Saddam needed to crush it brutally to prove he still controlled the country, but after the humiliating defeat, he couldn't trust all his generals. He needed someone who would execute orders without questioning them, no matter how brutal. He chose Qusay. Qusay was 25. He was given command over Republican Guard units with clear instructions: crush the rebellion without mercy, take no prisoners, level cities if necessary. And Qusay obeyed. For weeks, forces under his command bombarded Shiite cities, executed thousands, destroyed mosques. It was a brutal repression that left tens of thousands dead. Qusay returned to Baghdad with no celebration. He simply reported that the orders had been carried out. And in that moment, something shifted in how Saddam viewed his sons. Uday was uncontrollable, an orujie that could turn on the one holding it. Qusay was different. Lethal when ordered, still when not needed. The perfect weapon. From 1992 onward, Qusay rose through the regime's secret structures. He was given control over the special security organization, internal intelligence, that monitored everyone inside the regime. Qusay knew who was being investigated, who was suspected, and he reported everything to his father without filters. He was given control over the Special Republican Guard, the troops who protected Saddam directly. They didn't fight at borders, they crushed coups, carried out purges. And in the final years of the regime, he became, in practice, second in command, even if not officially. Saddam never publicly named a successor, but everyone knew. If something happened to Saddam, Qusay would take control. Uday had been displaced, and he knew it, and it poisoned his relationship with his brother. There's something few people knew about Qusay. He kept a private life almost completely separate from his public role. He was married, he had 3 children. Mustafa was the oldest, born in 1988, and 2 more whose names rarely appeared because Qusay protected them from public exposure. Unlike Uday, who dragged everyone into his chaotic orbit, Qusay kept his family isolated. His children didn't attend official events. They lived in private residences, not in visible palaces. Bodyguards described a different Qusay in private moments. Not the cold executor, but a father who played with his children in enclosed gardens, who read to them, who tried within impossible limits to give them something that resembled a normal childhood. But that normality was an illusion, because Qusay knew what kind of world his children lived in. And he knew that if the regime fell, they would pay the price simply for the surname. And then what he feared happened. March 2003. The United States invades. The Iraqi army collapses in weeks. April 9th, Saddam's statues fall. The Hussein family is on the run. Saddam disappears into hiding inside Iraq. Qusay does too, but he isn't alone. He has Mustafa with him, his 14-year-old son. Why did he take his teenage son with him instead of getting him out of the country? No one knows. Maybe he believed keeping him close was the only way to protect him. Maybe he didn't trust anyone else. Maybe he couldn't bear to let go while the world was collapsing. For months they moved through Iraq. At some point they reunite with Uday. The three of them end up in Mosul, hiding in the house of Nawaf al-Saidan in the Al-Falah neighborhood. But someone betrays them. The information reaches American forces. The price, $15 million for each Hussein brother. July 20, 2003. 1 in the afternoon. Troops surround the mansion. Qusay is inside with Uday, Mustafa, and a bodyguard. They have weapons enough to resist, and they know how this ends. They don't try to negotiate. They don't try to surrender because they know the recent history. They believe surrender doesn't guarantee a fair trial. They believe they will be displayed. And they know that one way or another, their deaths have already been decided. The battle lasts 6 hours. Qusay Hussein, the son who obeyed every order for 37 years, the one who never rebelled, the one who believed absolute loyalty would keep him safe, dies defending an impossible position. And beside him dies Mustafa, a teenager who never had the chance to choose his life, who was born into a cursed surname, who spent his last months on the run with his father, and who dies at 14 in a battle he never should have fought. All 4 bodies are recovered by U.S. forces. Photos are published to confirm identities images that spark international controversy because they show the corpses in conditions many consider violations of basic human dignity. Today, more than 20 years later, Qusay is remembered in complicated ways. For Iraqis who suffered under the regime, Qusay was an integral part of the machinery of repression, head of internal intelligence, the man who oversaw torture, the executor of purges. Not less guilty than Uday, just more efficient. For military analysts, Qusay represents the kind of figure that makes authoritarian regimes possible. The competent professional who carries out orders without questioning them, no matter how brutal. But what no one can deny is that Qusay lived by an impossible logic. He believed absolute obedience would protect him, that if he never failed, never questioned, always executed exactly what was ordered, he would be safe, that he could protect his family by being the perfect son. And he died discovering that this strategy was as fatal as Uday's uncontrolled violence, just slower, more methodical, but equally lethal. In the end, Qusay chose obedience as a survival strategy, and that obedience led him to die alongside his teenage son in a battle with no way out, defending a regime that had already collapsed weeks earlier. But if Uday chose excess and Qusay chose perfect obedience, there was a third strategy, one that only one of Saddam's children executed successfully: to escape before everything collapsed and survive long enough to tell the story from exile. That strategy belongs to Raghad Hussein, and her story is the longest of all because it's the only one that still continues. Raghad was born in 1967 in Baghdad. She was the oldest daughter of Saddam and Sajida. In a family where the sons were obvious heirs to power, where Uday and Qusay fought for attention through violence and obedience, Raghad occupied a different space. She wasn't invisible, but she wasn't at the center of power. She was the president's daughter. And in the patriarchal structure of the Ba'athist regime, that meant her role would eventually be to marry someone politically useful. But from a young age, Raghad showed something neither Uday nor Qusay had: a cold, detached ability to observe. While her brothers were immersed in the power dynamic competing for approval, Raghad watched from enough distance to see the cracks. When she was 12, her tutor taught her about the French Revolution and the fall of the monarchy. Raghad asked a question that made the woman uncomfortable. Were the king's daughters executed too? The tutor answered yes, that the royal family had been guillotined or died in prison. Raghad said nothing else, but the tutor later remembered her expression. Not horror, understanding. She was 12 when she asked that. In 1983, when Raghad was 16, her marriage was arranged to Hussein Kamel al-Majid, her cousin. Hussein Kamel was 10 years older, already a military officer, rising in importance within the regime. It wasn't a marriage for love. It was political. Saddam consolidating loyalty within the al-Takriti clan. Raghad accepted without public protest. She learned early that protesting didn't change decisions. It only made consequences worse. She married him, and for the next 12 years she lived as the wife of Iraq's Minister of Military Industry, the man overseeing the regime's most secret weapons programs. Her life through the 1980s and early 1990s was a gilded prison. Mansions, access to whatever luxuries sanctions still allowed, occasional trips abroad with her husband on diplomatic visits. But she was trapped. Her husband reported directly to her father. Her private life didn't exist, because everything she did eventually reached Saddam's ears. And she saw things. She watched Uday destroy lives impulsively. She watched Qusay carry out brutal orders without blinking. She watched her father eliminate threats through calculated violence. And she learned something fundamental. Family loyalty wasn't a shield. It was an illusion that lasted only until you stopped being useful. August 1995, the moment that changed everything. Hussein Kamel made the most radical decision possible. He defected from Iraq, and Raghad went with him. Not necessarily because she believed it was right, but because staying behind after her husband betrayed Saddam would have meant death. The escape was planned in secret for weeks. Hussein Kamel trusted no one except his brother, Saddam Kamel, who was married to Rana Raghad's younger sister. In the middle of the night, two entire families crossed into Jordan in a convoy of vehicles, taking what they could pack and leaving everything else behind. King Hussein of Jordan granted them asylum not out of kindness, but political calculation. Hussein Kamel had valuable information about Iraq's weapons programs, information Western intelligence services desperately wanted. For 6 months, Raghad lived in Jordan as an exile. Her husband gave interviews, revealed secrets, spoke to the CIA, to UN inspectors, provided details about chemical and biological weapons programs Iraq had hidden for years. And every word he said publicly stabbed deeper into Saddam Hussein. And in February 1996, Hussein Kamel made the mistake Raghad immediately understood would get them killed. He believed the amnesty Saddam promised. Raghad tried to stop him. People close to the family in Jordan later confirmed she begged him not to return, that the promise of forgiveness was obviously a trap, that her father never forgave betrayal. But Hussein Kamel didn't listen. Maybe he truly believed blood ties meant something. Maybe he just couldn't endure exile. On February 20th, 1996, they crossed back into Iraq. 3 days later, on February 23rd, Hussein Kamel and his brother Saddam Kamel were dead. Raghad witnessed the beginning. She heard the first bursts of gunfire as members of the Al-Majid clan supposedly acting for family honor after the betrayal surrounded the house where the brothers were hiding in Baghdad. Hussein Kamel and his brother resisted for hours with weapons, defending the home. In the end, both died in the shootout. The exact operational details were never fully made public, but everyone in Iraq knew the truth. Nobody moves against a member of the presidential family without Saddam Hussein's direct approval. And in that moment, listening to the gunfire that was killing her husband, Raghad, understood something that would change the rest of her life. Her father had orchestrated the murder of the father of her children. Blood ties didn't mean protection. They meant control. And when that control broke, the family itself became the weapon of punishment. But Raghad wasn't executed. She was taken back to the presidential palaces along with her sister Rana, both widows, with no real power, but alive. And for the next 7 years, they lived in Baghdad under constant surveillance by a regime that knew they had tried to escape once already. She didn't speak publicly about her husband's death. She didn't cry in public. She didn't challenge the official version that the clan had acted for honor. She simply existed in a suspended state, waiting for the next chance to flee. But this time she would do it only when the regime was so weak it couldn't reach her. That opportunity came in March 2003, when American troops invaded Iraq, when Baghdad began to fall, when the regime was collapsing in real time. Raghad did what she had learned 7 years earlier. She ran, this time alone, this time without a husband whose public betrayal could put her in danger, this time silently, discreetly crossing into Jordan, while Baghdad burned and the regime entered its final hours. And this time she never returned. King Abdullah of Jordan granted her asylum not for the same reasons his father had sheltered Hussein Kamal in 1995, but because Raghad no longer had valuable secrets to trade. The regime had fallen. Military programs were no longer the currency they had been. And deporting her to Iraq would have meant handing her to courts that would judge her for being Saddam Hussein's daughter, regardless of her personal guilt in the regime's crimes. Raghad Hussein has lived in Amman, Jordan since 2003. More than 20 years have passed, and in all that time she has done something neither Uday nor Qusay managed to do: survive. But survival has a price. She lives under constant protection in a residence provided by the Jordanian state. She can't leave Jordan because several countries, including post-Saddam Iraqi authorities, have issued arrest warrants for her. They accuse her of financing insurgencies against the new Iraqi government, laundering money from the fallen regime, and crimes committed during her father's years in power. And she does something many people find impossible to understand. She defends Saddam Hussein's legacy. In the occasional interviews she has given from exile, Raghad describes her father as a misunderstood leader, someone who made difficult decisions to protect Iraq from external threats. She rejects accusations of crimes against humanity. She denies atrocities documented by international investigators, by survivors, even by records from the regime itself. She insists history will judge him differently someday. Does she genuinely believe what she says? Or is it a psychological survival strategy? Because admitting her father's full guilt would mean admitting that her entire life, every privilege she enjoyed, every opportunity she had, was built on the systematic suffering of millions of Iraqis. It would mean admitting that the man who raised her, who chose her husband, who ultimately ordered that husband's death, was responsible for some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. In 2006, when Saddam Hussein was executed in Baghdad after being tried and convicted for crimes against humanity, Raghad released a statement from Amman condemning the trial as illegitimate, a political circus orchestrated by foreign occupiers. She called her father a martyr, an Arab leader who resisted to the end against Western invasion, and she promised that one day, when history was written more objectively, the truth about Saddam Hussein would be known. Raghad Hussein is now 58 years old. She lives in a villa in a residential neighborhood of Amman, surrounded by discreet but constant security, isolated from a world that largely rejects her for her surname and for her refusal to distance herself from her father's legacy. Her own children, if she maintains regular contact with them, live separate lives. Some, according to unconfirmed reports, live under different names, trying to escape the weight of being Saddam Hussein's grandchildren. For some Iraqis, especially those who still sympathize with the old Ba'athist regime, or who see the 2003 invasion as a catastrophe that destroyed the country, Raghad represents continuity. The last public voice of the Hussein family, still speaking, still defending the narrative that the regime, despite its excesses, was legitimate and necessary. For most Iraqis and for the international community, Raghad represents absolute denial, the inability or refusal to confront the historical reality of what her family did for decades, the privilege of living comfortably in exile while millions of the regime's victims never got justice, never recovered their disappeared relatives, never rebuilt the lives Saddam's system destroyed. But what no one can deny, whatever they think of her public statements, is that Raghad survived by using a strategy her brothers couldn't or wouldn't execute, leaving at the exact right moment, not too early when the regime still had the reach and resources to drag her back or punish her, not too late when invading forces would have captured her alongside the other family members, exactly at the point of collapse when chaos gave her enough cover to cross the border and vanish into permanent exile. And today, more than 2 decades after the regime fell, she is the only one of Saddam Hussein's 3 central children still alive, the only one who can tell her version of the story, however controversial. the only one still carrying the Hussein name without being buried beneath it. Raghad chose exile as her final survival strategy, and exile gave her what neither Uday's uncontrolled power nor Qusay's perfect obedience could buy: time. Time to keep living. Time to keep defending a legacy most of the world has condemned. Time to exist in a limbo where she isn't fully free, where she can't return to her homeland, where she lives under constant threat of extradition, but where she also isn't dead. It's a form of survival, maybe the only form possible for someone with her surname and her history. In the end, three central children of Saddam Hussein, three radically different lives, three choices that define them completely. Uday chose to live without limits, believing absolute power without restraint was freedom, believing that if he couldn't earn his father's respect through obedience, he would earn it by being so visible, so powerful, so feared that no one could ignore him. He died at 39 in the Battle of Mosul on July 22, 2003, cornered in a house that wasn't his, hunted by the most powerful army in the world, defending a position he'd lost before the fight even began. Qusay chose perfect obedience, believing that never failing would keep him safe, believing that if he always carried out his father's exact orders, without questioning, without hesitation, he could protect himself and protect his family. He died that same day, July 22nd at 37, shielding his teenage son in the last minutes of a battle with no exit, fulfilling to the end the role of loyal heir his father assigned him. Raghad chose to survive by escaping at the precise moment the regime collapsed, when chaos gave her enough cover to disappear, but before invading forces could capture her. She lives today at 58, in an exile that will never end, defending a legacy most of the world rejects, trapped between the family loyalties she chose to keep and a historical reality she cannot change. Three different paths, but one question they faced from the day they were born: who are you when your surname is synonymous with terror for millions of people? When you were born into a palace built on absolute power, enforced through systematic violence. When every privilege you enjoyed in childhood and youth came directly from the suffering of others. Because none of them chose to be born as Saddam Hussein's children. None of them asked to inherit that surname and everything it meant. None of them decided their father would rule Iraq through an authoritarian regime that for 24 years executed, tortured, and disappeared tens of thousands. But all of them had to live with the consequences of decisions they never made, with a legacy they never chose, with a name that defined them before they could define themselves. And that may be the harshest truth of all. There are inheritances you can't fully refuse. You can flee to Jordan and live in exile for decades. You can die defending your last position in an impossible battle. You can live without moral limits until the world finally catches you. But you never fully escape the past, the surname, the decisions your father made that marked your life before you were even born. You either learn to live with it or you die trying. Today, more than 20 years after that battle in Mosul, Uday and Qusay Hussein are buried in marked graves in a tribal cemetery in Tikrit, their father's hometown, beside Saddam Hussein, who was executed by hanging on December 30th, 2006 after being convicted of crimes against humanity. 3 generations of a family that ruled through terror silence forever. Raghad is still alive in Amman, giving occasional interviews where she insists history will judge her father differently, that accusations were exaggerated, that the regime, despite its mistakes, was necessary, that Iraq is worse today than it was under her father. None of the 3 has the life they imagined as children, running through the gardens of presidential palaces without yet understanding the full weight of the name they carried. But all of them have the lives their choices, or in some cases, the lack of choices built for them. The lives their survival strategies allowed. And that's what they have to live with. Or in Uday and Qusay's case, what they had to die for. Because in the end, power goes out, regimes fall, palaces are looted and turned into museums of the crimes committed behind their walls, statues come down, recorded speeches become relics of an era most people would rather forget. But families keep bleeding, victims keep remembering, and these stories stay complicated and uncomfortable, resisting simple narratives of heroes and villains. These stories remind us that behind every dictator, there are human beings who pay the price of absolute power. Sometimes it's the victims of the regime, the millions who suffered under brutal policies. But sometimes it's also the children who never chose to be born into that family, who grew up trapped between privileges they didn't ask for and consequences they didn't fully deserve. And both deserve to be remembered, not to justify, not to absolve, but to understand the full complexity of what absolute power does to families, to societies, to human beings caught in its orbit. If the story of Saddam Hussein's children hit you, you should know they're not the only ones. Absolute power, total control over millions of lives for decades always collects a price, and families pay it from the inside in ways the outside world rarely sees until everything collapses. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for 42 years longer, even than Saddam ruled Iraq. He survived multiple assassination attempts allegedly backed by foreign powers. He defied the West for decades, presenting himself as the revolutionary leader of the Arab world. And his children lived lives just as complex, just as violent, just as marked by a surname that became synonymous with tyranny. There was Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the reformer's son, who studied at the London School of Economics, who wrote a doctoral thesis about democratization, who promised to modernize Libya and open it to the world. Today, after years in prison during and after Libya's civil war, he walks free but pursued, and he is planning something many consider unthinkable: a return to power, a run for president in the same Libya where his father was hunted and killed in the streets. There was Hannibal Gaddafi, kidnapped in Lebanon years after the regime fell, held and allegedly tortured for years in secret prisons without trial, and only recently released after an ordeal that included hunger strikes and denunciations by international human rights organizations. There was Mutassim Gaddafi, the military son who wanted to be the heir, who died the same day as his father, October 20th, 2011, when Sirte finally fell to rebel forces, defending the regime's last position to the end while the world watched the images. Because what happened to Gaddafi's children after their father fell, the decisions they made when the regime collapsed in real time during the Arab Spring of 2011, the survival strategies they chose in those final chaotic days, reveals truths about power, family, and inheritance that are even more complex than the story of Saddam Hussein's children. On this channel, we uncover the stories that stayed hidden for decades, the lives behind sensational headlines, the people behind absolute power, and the human consequences of regimes that shaped the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. If you believe these truths deserve to be told with the complexity they require, without simplifications, without easy judgments, but with the historical depth needed to truly understand what happened, then you're in the right place, because final decisions always leave questions without easy answers. Regimes fall, but stories remain, and they deserve to be heard in full. Power goes out, dictators die or are executed, palaces stand empty or become museums, but the scars remain in families, in victims, in entire countries that take generations to heal. And these are their stories.